Hi, everybody. I'm Shira. I'm a doctoral candidate at Harvard Law School. This is joint work with Christina, who's here at the audience, from GW. So Christina and I kind of started coming across different tensions between consistency and arbitrariness in algorithmic decision making. And I'm going to give a little bit of an example to motivate this. This is based off a paper by Citrin and Pasquale. It's a little bit tedious, it's a long quote, so bear with me. So they say, credit scoring systems produce arbitrary results as demonstrated by the wide dispersion of credit scores set by commercial credit bureaus. In a study of 500,000 files, 29% of consumers had credit scores that differed by at least 50 points between the three credit bureaus. Barring some undisclosed divergent aims of the bureaus, these variations suggest a substantial proportion of arbitrary assessments. So they try to claim that people that have different results depending on which algorithm they encounter is kind of evidence for arbitrariness. Okay, great, that makes sense. So why don't we have kind of a standardized one algorithm that has a standardized process across an ecosystem? But that also has a problem. So in a different place in the paper, they say, in many accounts of the financial crisis, credit scores exerted significant influence. As Amarbide argued, the idea of one best way to rank credit applicants flattened the distributed varying judgment of loan officers into nationwide credit scores, a number focused on persons rather than community. So there's kind of an interesting trade-off and question that comes up. So which world do we prefer? Do we want diversity of models, but perhaps arbitrary assessments, or do we want kind of a standardized process, but risking outcome homogenization or flattening of nuance, and kind of these persistent winners and losers? And scholars have focused on both of these problems kind of separately, but what this paper really tries to do is shine a light on the trade-offs and tensions between these two problems. So I'm going to back up a little bit and start unpacking these terms and describe the scholarship that we're building on. So predictive models are typically consistent or deterministic, right? So the same input is supposed to yield the same output. And of course, this is one of the main advantages of predictive models over human decision makers because it helps uphold procedural regularity. It satisfies some conception of equal treatment because it ensures that like cases are treated alike, and it increases trust and legitimacy in the decision-making process. But at scale, when everybody's using the same model, consistency can lead to outcome homogenization. So imagine, different employers that are all using the same off-the-shelf algorithm to make the same decisions. Why is this bad? It could lead to correlated failures. It can kind of lead to the systemic exclusion of the same individuals over and over again. It standardizes the decision-making process. So, in the context of employment, people kind of converge on the same notion of merit, for example. And this is bad not only for the people subject to the decisions, it's also bad for the decision makers themselves because they're not getting the candidates that they would have otherwise gotten in a more diverse ecosystem. Okay, so we said that predictive models are consistent. At the same time, these models have also been described as arbitrary for certain ways. So there are different sources of arbitrariness that we list in the paper, and we connect them to different notions of arbitrariness. One of them is non-determinism, so the model creation process is non-deterministic. Another one is predictive multiplicity, which is this idea that potentially there could exist different equally accurate models that vary in their individual level predictions. So if I make the choice between these different models without any intention or thought process behind it, or capriciously in a sense, that means the predictions last justification. Lastly, there's multiplicity in the ecosystem. So this is kind of like in the credit example model, where different decision makers adopt different models, which leads to different outcomes for similarly situated individuals. So arbitrariness, of course, is not a good thing, precisely for the reasons that consistency is good. It could lead to loss of justification in decision-making, it could erode procedural regularity, and it heightens the risk of gaming, but there are also upsides to arbitrariness. It provides flexibility and allows for kind of a plurality of values. So the three main contributions are in our paper. One, we try to unpack different notions of consistency and arbitrariness. Two, we argue that the literature often treats these problems in isolation, overlooking, one, their core trade-offs, and two, kind of more importantly, and this is really the gist, how remedies for one problem can inadvertently exacerbate the other problem. Lastly, we try to propose a principled framework to guide the management of these tensions and trade-offs. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus mostly on the second point here, so really the issues. In the paper, we list 5 different tensions and trade-offs between consistency and arbitrariness. And this is the part that we really try to bring these two things into conversation with each other and understand how they intersect. So I'm going to focus on the first, the fourth, and the fifth tension here. The first tension is relatively straightforward, competing effects. So this is kind of like the credit example, right? So the ecosystem, we really have a choice. Do we want a homogenized landscape where the same model kind of standardizes the process and the same people are getting the same predictions? Or do we want a diversity of models? And this is really a question that probably depends on context or domains, but it invites kind of an answer to a normative question if, again, we want consistency of decisions across the entire ecosystem, or we want different decision makers in the same ecosystem to reach divergent results. The second and third tensions are a little bit more complex, but at a high level, really what they try to do, really what we try to show here, is that consistency is often used to try to solve the problems that are associated with arbitrariness, and arbitrariness is used to solve the problems that are associated with consistency. So these are kind of two examples of that. So first, we have predictive multiplicity is often leveraged by scholars to address the problems that are associated with outcome homogenization. So let's break this down a bit. These scholars are focusing on one axis of the problem. They're looking at outcome homogenization. So again, like different employers that are all kind of converging on the same algorithm, which leads to systemic exclusion of the same individuals. What is the solution? So scholars have proposed to leverage predictive multiplicity, the idea of, again, that there are different equally accurate models, and for each decision, they're kind of going to randomly choose between a model and apply it for their given case. Why does this help? Basically breaks down systemic exclusion, because applicants that are excluded by one model can still be selected by another. So even in an ecosystem where everybody uses the same model, because we're kind of leveraging predictive multiplicity each time a different model is being chosen, even though everybody's using the same algorithm. But this is kind of a partial problem because it trades the problems that are associated with consistency with those that are associated with arbitrariness, right? So identical candidates may receive different outcomes depending on which model is drawn. So we solve the problems that are associated with outcome homogenization, but we introduce new problems. Okay, this problem is a little bit the inverse. So here, there's kind of a different body of literature that talks about how to use some notion of outcome homogenization to address predictive multiplicity. What does that look like? So here, these scholars are kind of focusing on the opposite problem. Again, they're just focusing on one axis of the problem. They're trying to solve the arbitrariness that's associated with predictive multiplicity. Again, this idea that there could potentially be equally accurate models, but if my decision between these models is not motivated by some rationale, the prediction could lack justification. These scholars propose to force that different models with equal accuracy converge on a single prediction, perhaps through aggregation methods. This is great for on one side because it averages out the variability and smooths over inconsistencies. So really we're addressing the arbitrariness that's associated with predictive multiplicity. But it introduces a new problem. It trades this problem with those that are associated with consistency. Because if everybody in the ecosystem does this, even if decision makers are using different models, it still pushes the landscape or the ecosystem into more homogenization. So really the main point here and the main takeaway is that addressing predictive multiplicity at the single model level has inevitable ripple effects on outcome homogenization at the ecosystem level and vice versa. So really what we're trying to argue here is that these two problems are interrelated, and to come up with a solution for each of them, really we need to look at these two problems together, or else we're going to end up with incomplete or counterproductive outcomes. The last part of our paper, we propose a normative framework that tries to solve this. And we try to address two questions. So one, at the ecosystem level, in which domains should models converge on the same outcomes, and where should they allow for variation? And at the single decision maker level, how can we reduce arbitrariness that's associated with predictive multiplicity in ways that align with broader ecosystem level objectives? I'm going to skip this for lack of time, but I'll say that our framework tries to offer criteria that guide nuanced domain-specific determinations to answer these questions. Thank you very much.